I responded to a call with another unit in a fairly new neighborhood. The call was sketchy and vague and classified as a disturbing the peace call. Upon arrival, the other officer and I knocked on the door, which was answered by a slightly sheepish guy in his early 30s. He was well-dressed with a conservative haircut. He said he was having a problem with hearing voices in his house. Our initial feeling was this was a normal person who was not experiencing any kind of mental breakdown. So our next step was to investigate where the voices might be coming from. His house was not connected to his neighbors' houses, and there were no obvious problems with loud radios, TVs, or other outside influences. The guy was very thoughtful and open to any suggestions we made for explaining the voices, but we were stumped. We asked him if he heard the voices now, and he said no. He added that the voices were not always there and had stopped just after he called on this occasion. He said they started soon after he moved in, and at first assumed they were from loud neighbors. After he continued to hear them at odd hours and times when neighbors were not home, he became worried. He admitted that he didn't think the police could help, but he had no one else to call. After we felt we had investigated every source we could, we had to tell him we couldn't help. We actually felt bad because we didn't have any solution to offer him. As the other officer and I walked back to our cars, we just looked at each other as if to say, that was spooky. A few months later, I drove through the neighborhood and noted a sold sign on his front lawn. I guess he found a solution on his own. We were doing a foot search for a burglar in a 600-unit townhome complex. The townhomes all looked the same. Same architecture, color, kind of a faded yellow color, and trim. It was nighttime, but we had some light from street lights, lights from windows, porch lights, security lights, and our flashlights. As we were walking along between a row of townhouses, I saw that one townhome had been painted much darker than all the rest. That caught my eye, but as I was searching the bushes near that unit, something else attracted my eye. The paint seemed to be changing very slightly. It was still a dark color, but it just seemed like something was off. I lit up the wall. Every square inch was covered in thumb-sized cockroaches. I jumped back and probably said something like, "Shit!" because the deputies I was with came over to see what was going on. When they saw the wall, they all jumped back too. They weren't all over the row of townhouses. They were just on that one unit. The adjacent units were the usual pale yellow. There was a clean boundary between the roaches and the adjacent units, just like if the unit had been painted with roaches. That was weird. Never saw it again. I was off duty yet armed, which wasn't my norm, walking through a small strip mall, maybe 6-7 stores small. I started daydreaming about actions I would take if one of the stores I walked past was being robbed. Not that unusual to pre-plan such things. But then the feelings got super intense, as if it was going to happen, to the point I unzipped my fanny pack, I'm dating myself, and gripped my firearm in case I needed to quick draw. I stayed in that position until I got to my car, and then waited about a minute looking at the stores, just in case. I was in what we call code orange, bordering on red. I finally shook it off, got in my car and drove home and wondered why I had worked myself up so much. The next day's headline was about a double homicide in that parking lot literally 2 minutes after I drove off. I called a buddy at that PD to get the location, and it was the next aisle from where I was parked about 100 in max away. That one haunted me for a while, wondering if I could have saved either victim. In reality, probably couldn't, as the suspect ambushed his ex-wife and mother-in-law during a child custody exchange. But had I been there, it would have definitely resulted in a firefight after the initial killings. Regardless, there was a guardian angel that day that got in my head and made sure I was ready. I may not be a police officer, but a firefighter. We once got a call for a possible fire on a hillside. My station I was staying at was only a few miles away. The next closest station was 15 miles. I knew I was going to be there first. During the whole drive, I was looking up on the hill trying to see the fire, not seeing any fire. I went to the RP location to ask them where they thought they saw it. He pointed in the direction, and I could see nothing but what looked like smoke. After consulting a map, this was before we had GPS or cell phones, I saw that there was a road leading to the general area. By this time, I could see other units coming, but they were still a few miles out. I relayed access to the road to them and went and drove up the road. I got up to the point where I thought I had seen the smoke and saw what looked like a fog cloud moving down the hill away from my location. The road that I was on curved to that location. At this point, I was confident that we didn't have a fire, but this fog cloud did not act like fog I have seen before. There seemed to be form to it. I radioed in that there was no fire at this location, and any unit en route could disregard it. There was already a unit on the road where I was, and they soon joined me. In that truck were two of our youngest firefighters. I pointed out the fog, and right off one of them freaked out and said he had seen that before as a kid. He said he is willing to bet that there was a burial site close by. He said it was believed that the fog is a cluster of ghosts together, chilling the air as they moved, creating the appearance of fog. In a time we normally wouldn't have fog. Midsummer, the fog dissipated shortly after. The following morning I did a little research and found that there had been a cave-in at a mine site up on the hill, in the area where the fog was first reported. And where the fog dissipated was in the general area of where the miners would have camped. The story was, 15 miners were inside the mine when the roof collapsed, and although there was an attempt to recover the bodies, none were ever found. Rescue had become too dangerous and abandoned the attempt. I was driving down this side street with my partner at 3 a.m. On one side was a high wall that led to a steep dirt incline and some apartments. On the other side was a college with high chain link fences about 12s high. We were cruising down leisurely and saw a dark figure cross the street about 150 yards in front of us from the incline side to the college side. My partner and I drove past the guy, and about a second later, we turned to each other and asked each other at the same time, "Did that guy have legs?" I stopped the car in the middle of the street, and we discussed how we just saw a dark figure, but we didn't see any legs or feet. Just basically a figure floating across the street. So being good cops and bored, I turned the car around to where the guy crossed. Nothing, nobody, nowhere. We got out of the car and looked up and down the street. Nothing. There's no way to climb the incline on the apartment side. There is nothing on the college side. We looked inside the fence. It was a concession area for the stadium and fenced off, so there's nowhere to go inside there either, even if you were able to climb the fence and jump down. We couldn't find the guy at all, so we just got back in the car and drove off. A little faster this time. Years ago, I took a call from a young woman who had stepped in front of a train and committed. When I arrived on scene, she had been thrown forward exactly 100 feet from the point of impact and had landed still near the tracks. Her body looked perfectly intact. She was wearing a pure white dress, and she had no visible sign of trauma at first glance. What I saw next had no explanation. Her heart was lying right next to her body and looked like it was surgically removed. All 4 arteries were cleanly cut equidistant from the heart. The opening in her chest was barely visible. Other than that, you would never know a 70 miles per hour train had just hit her. I later learned that she had suffered from depression since childhood and she had planned her death, drinking a 6-pack to get up the courage. She left behind several young children and an abusive husband, but was loved by everyone like an angel. I took what happened with the way she was dressed in all white like an angel as an omen, and she died of a broken heart, breaking everyone's heart, actually. My 30 years of law enforcement experience was as a sheriff in a large metropolitan jail. One of my unexplainable events was when I was a sergeant supervising the medical unit at the jail. A deputy called me over to this inmate's cell. "Sarge, you better take a look at this." I walked to the cell and observed a naked mentally ill inmate in a floor-flush cell. The inmate had refused to take his prescribed medication and had decompensated mentally to the point where he was speaking in tongues while smearing his own feces on his body and the cell walls. The inmate was rolling his eyes and putting his entire right hand into his anus. I called the psychiatric doctor on duty to the cell. The doctor observed the inmate and tried to talk to the inmate through the closed door. The inmate stopped, realizing he was being watched, laughed evilly and angrily, and somehow scaled the cinder block wall on the west side of the cell and put his feces handprints on the ceiling of the cell, jumped down and began sticking both of his hands in his anus, while yelling incoherently at us in a language I have never heard before. The ceiling of the cell is 12 feet high. The deputy and I looked at the doctor for an explanation of how the inmate just scale a 12-foot-high cinder block wall and put his feces handprints on the ceiling. The shocked doctor looked at us sheepishly and said, "Well, there's something you don't see every day." We ended up extracting the inmate with an extraction team using force as he violently fought us. The doctor administered an involuntary injection of medication to the inmate as we held him down. I say this incident was paranormal because from my perspective, the individual was possessed. The inmate was released from our custody to the Metropolitan Hospital on a 72-hour mental health hold about 2 hours later after being sentenced to time served for his misdemeanor offense. The inmate was adjudicated without ever stepping in the courtroom. The psychiatric doctor had called the judge immediately after the incident. The inmate had been arrested 3 days prior for trespass and had been too psychotic to be escorted to court.